This story is about the Helderberg incident, which happened on November 28, 1987. It was around 2:45, a very quiet time in the air traffic control ATC tower at the Mahi Airport in the Indian Ocean. There weren't many flights scheduled at this hour, and the controllers were waiting for the next plane to arrive. This plane was South African Airways Flight 295, which was also known as Springbok 295. The flight was expected to arrive soon, but it was still too far out over the vast Indian Ocean to be detected on the radar. Then a voice suddenly crackled over the radio, and the controller thought it was just a routine check-in from the flight. However, this quickly turned into something more serious. The pilot of Flight 295, which was now outside of radar range, reported a problem. He explained that there was smoke in the airplane, and they were making an emergency descent to 15,000 feet. He requested full emergency assistance. The air traffic controllers immediately prepared for a full emergency and began coordinating efforts to help the plane. They were ready to provide all the necessary support for the flight. But before they could take any action, something went wrong. The radio went silent. The ATC tried to reach the plane again, but got no response. The minutes passed, and still there was no answer. For about half an hour, the ATC repeatedly tried to contact Springbok 295, but the radio was dead. This made things even more urgent. Without communication and no location to go on, they couldn't start a search. They had a big problem. They didn't know where to search. The Indian Ocean was dark, vast, and empty. The last coordinates the captain had provided were only approximate, and because the plane was out of radar range, the search was blind. The search efforts continued throughout the day. Search planes were sent out, but the uncertainty about where the plane had gone made it hard to know where to start. They didn't have any leads. It wasn't until 5 days later that a small piece of good news came. Some wreckage from the plane was discovered in the ocean about 200 kilometers northeast of the Mahi Airport. This was the first concrete evidence that the plane had crashed. Along with the debris, investigators found 8 bodies. This was a grim discovery, but it was just a small part of the puzzle. Most of the wreckage was still missing. The investigation began. The captain of the flight was David Ice, and the first officer was David Idwell. The flight engineer was G. Fry. There were also 2 additional relief crew members, but they weren't involved in the story that would unfold. Before taking off, the crew completed all of their regular pre-flight checks, and everything appeared to be in order. However, there was one small detail. The captain had been handed a confidential document to sign before takeoff, and he did so without sharing its contents with the rest of the crew. As the plane left Taiwan, 140 passengers boarded the flight, and 6 cargo containers were loaded onto the plane. During the loading process, a Taiwanese customs official performed a surprise inspection of the cargo. After about 10 minutes of checking, he signed off saying everything was fine. The plane took off an hour later than scheduled, heading toward Johannesburg, South Africa. The plane climbed to cruising altitude, and the relief crew took over flying duties. For the next 8 hours, they continued the flight. As the flight continued, investigators later noticed something strange about the plane's route. It appeared that the plane was deliberately avoiding land and mostly sticking to international waters. In the 1980s, South Africa was under an oppressive apartheid regime that denied black South Africans basic rights. As a result, many countries imposed sanctions on South Africa, making it a global outcast. Because of this, South African Airways had restrictions on flying over certain nations, and flights had to take longer, more circuitous routes to avoid these countries. This is why Flight 295 was taking such a strange path over the ocean. At the same time, South Africa was fighting a war in Angola and needed weapons and technology. Since many countries were boycotting South Africa, the government had trouble acquiring what it needed. Taiwan, another country that faced international isolation, was friendly with South Africa. Taiwan also produced advanced electronic equipment, and the two countries allegedly shared military secrets. It is believed that the cargo on Flight 295 was sensitive military equipment and that it was being transported secretly, avoiding radar detection by flying over the ocean where there was less coverage. To communicate during the flight, the planes relied on high-frequency radios to send their position and other important information to the South African Airways headquarters. They also used a station called ZER, which recorded all communications on magnetic tape for later review. This communication system would become a key part of the investigation, but not in the way anyone expected. Back in the investigation, the bodies of the 8 people found in the water showed signs of severe trauma, which wasn't normal for a crash. When blood tests were done, it was found that the victims had smoke and soot in their lungs. This suggested they had died from suffocation before the crash, possibly due to a fire on board. The radio transmissions from the pilot also mentioned a fire, which led to theories that the plane had been bombed. Some speculated that the Angolan terrorists who were at war with South Africa might have been responsible. Investigators examined pieces of the wreckage for signs of an explosion, like unusual markings or cavities, but they found nothing to suggest a bomb had been used. However, they did find something curious: a melted tennis racket. This was strange because tennis rackets are made from graphite, which melts at very high temperatures above 600 degrees Celsius. The temperatures on a plane don't usually get that high, so the fact that a tennis racket had melted indicated something unusual. The official cargo manifest listed the items on the plane as medical equipment, textiles, and sports gear, but the investigators weren't so sure. To verify this, they asked South African Airways for the original cargo document. However, when they requested it, they were told that the document had been shredded immediately after the accident. Instead, they were given a copy of the cargo manifest, which raised more questions. The official records didn't match up, and with the political situation in South Africa, it was hard to trust any of the documents provided. The investigators were still looking for the flight data and voice recorders, the black boxes which could hold crucial information. These devices emit signals for 30 days after the crash, so the time was running out. It took 21 days just to mobilize the salvage boat to search for the black boxes in the Indian Ocean, and by the time the team arrived, they had just 1 week left before the pingers would stop. Time was running out, and the search for the truth was becoming more urgent. After the 30th day following the crash, investigators were still unable to find the wreckage or the black boxes. However, they did discover something that could provide valuable information: the ZOR tapes. If the pilots had communicated with the ZOR station about any emergency, the tapes could contain important clues. Investigators immediately requested these tapes from South African Airways, but the response they received was troubling: the tapes were missing. South African Airways explained that since 30 days had passed, the tapes had been overwritten and were no longer available. The tapes from the previous and next days were still intact, but the critical ZOR tapes, which might have contained information about the crash, were gone. This was a huge setback, especially considering that by this point the investigation had already cost $1.5 million. With the ZOR tapes missing and no other solid leads, the pressure mounted on the investigation team. They had no choice but to find other ways to gather information. In a desperate move, they decided to deploy sonar scanners to map the ocean floor. This was their last hope of finding the black boxes, which might hold crucial data about what happened to the flight. While the investigation continued, the flight crew's experience before the crash is also critical. The flight had been underway for several hours when the relief crew handed control back to the main crew. The fire, which was later discovered to be one of the key causes of the crash, had not started yet. However, the captain decided to share some troubling information with the crew. He revealed that before takeoff he had been informed that there was a bomb on board the aircraft. This revelation stunned the first officer and the flight engineer. They questioned the captain, asking if anyone else knew about the bomb, and the captain responded that no one else was aware. He went on to explain that the paperwork had been forged and the bomb was government-owned. The first officer and engineer were in shock, with the flight engineer muttering that they were all dead. They were soon interrupted by the cabin crew, who asked them what they wanted for dinner. Months later, in January 1988, nearly 2 months after the crash, the search team finally made a breakthrough. Sonar detected a possible wreckage 134 nautical miles from their expected location. However, the wreckage was much deeper than expected, at a depth of 4.5 kilometers, which was deeper than even the Titanic wreck. This discovery would make the recovery the deepest and most expensive in history. To confirm the wreckage, the team decided to send a submarine equipped with cameras. However, the submarine required a 7 kilometers fiber optic cable to transmit footage, and such a cable didn't exist. It had to be custom manufactured, which would take months to complete. The team also had to reinforce the submarine to withstand the immense pressure of the deep ocean and retrofit it with special cameras capable of working in the deep, dark waters. Once the submarine was ready and lowered into the ocean, it mapped the debris field in detail. As the visuals began to come through, the team confirmed that they had found the wreckage of the Boeing 747, the Helderberg. The debris was scattered over a large area, a clear sign that the plane had broken apart in midair. Among the wreckage, investigators found 3 wristwatches frozen at the exact time of the final impact. The discovery was chilling, as it confirmed that the crash had been a violent one. As the investigation proceeded, the timeline of the flight began to take shape. The first officer noticed smoke coming from the right wing, followed by an explosive sound from the back of the airplane. The cockpit was soon filled with the deafening blare of alarms. It became clear that something had gone terribly wrong. What followed was a 19-minute nightmare, during which both the crew and the aircraft were pushed to their absolute limits. During this time, the flight crew did everything they could to try to control the situation, but the fire spread quickly and systems began to fail. Exactly 1 year after the crash, the search team made another important discovery. The cockpit voice recorder was found deep in the ocean. However, after being submerged for so long, much of the recording was corrupted, and they were left with only 80 seconds of clear audio. Unfortunately, the flight data recorder, which could have provided crucial details, was never found. It remains somewhere deep in the Indian Ocean to this day. The investigators began reconstructing the plane from the wreckage they had salvaged. They were able to pinpoint where the fire had started in a container located in the forward right section of the cargo hold. This was puzzling, as the container was supposed to contain only electronics and medical equipment, none of which should have burned at temperatures as high as 600 degrees Celsius. As the fire grew, smoke filled the cargo hold, and the fire became more intense, ripping through the electrical wiring. One by one, the circuit breakers on the flight engineer's panel began to pop, each one marking the loss of a critical system that the crew desperately needed to keep the plane in the air. The captain reacted quickly and ordered the first officer to follow the emergency checklist. They began a sharp descent to 14,000 feet to reduce the cabin pressure and slow the spread of the fire. However, the cargo deck was classified as a Class B compartment. While it had smoke detectors, it lacked an automatic fire suppression system. Boeing's design assumed the crew could manually fight the fire with handheld extinguishers, but the fire was too intense. A member of the cabin crew grabbed an extinguisher and raced toward the cargo hold, but the fire was so fierce that the extinguisher was powerless. Boeing had designed the passenger cabin to maintain higher air pressure than the cargo hold, so opening the bulkhead door would force air from the cabin into the cargo area and prevent smoke from entering the passenger area. However, the fire was so intense that the pressure in the cargo hold reversed this flow when the cabin crew opened the bulkhead door. This caused deadly smoke to pour into the cabin, suffocating the passengers. The captain attempted to contact air traffic control, but the nearest airport, Macias, was still over an hour away. The checklist instructed the crew to open the doors of the plane to allow fresh air into the cabin. Unfortunately, this only added more oxygen to the fire, causing it to grow rapidly. The crew tried to recirculate the air in the cabin, but instead of bringing in fresh air, it only circulated the toxic smoke from the cargo area, worsening the already dangerous conditions. As time passed, the crew's options became more limited. One by one, electrical systems failed, and the fire continued to rage. As the fire weakened the structure of the aircraft, the heat began to warp the metal, twisting it in ways the Boeing 747 was never designed to handle. The heat burned through the aircraft's skin, compromising its structure, and eventually the plane split into two. In an instant, both halves of the plane plummeted toward the ocean and crashed into the water, sealing the fate of everyone on board. This all happened within 2 minutes of the last communication with air traffic control. The investigators were left with many questions. What was in the cargo that caused the fire to burn at such high temperatures? Why was the cargo manifest shredded? And why were the Zor tapes mysteriously missing? While listening to the cockpit voice recordings, investigators noticed something odd. When the first officer reported smoke, the captain didn't react with surprise. Instead, he simply said that can't be happening. When the flight engineer suggested landing at Reunion Island, the captain responded, "No, I don't have a choice." This strange conversation raised suspicions that the crew may have been under pressure from South African Airways to keep flying despite knowing there was a bomb on board. The investigation also uncovered a disturbing detail. Traces of a chemical called ammonium perchlorate, which is a key ingredient in rocket fuel, were found in the wreckage. The presence of this chemical pointed to the possibility that the South African government was smuggling arms. Further investigation revealed that the shredded cargo manifest and missing Zor tapes seemed to support this theory. As the investigation continued, the South African government applied pressure to close the inquiry, quickly raising further suspicions that they were trying to hide the truth. In the end, the investigation concluded without finding a definitive answer about the fire's cause. However, the Helderberg disaster did lead to significant changes in aviation safety. The tragedy exposed serious gaps in cargo fire protection, particularly in Class B cargo compartments, which lacked automatic fire suppression systems. As a result, new international regulations were introduced requiring cargo compartments to be equipped with automated fire suppression systems. Additionally, stricter standards for cargo documentation were implemented to ensure that the kinds of forged records found in the Helderberg case would never happen again.